Bueno, buenas tardes a todos. Gracias. Primero hago mías las palabras de todos los conferencistas hasta ahora, agradeciendo a la Revista Semana, a Andrea Cobar y su equipo tan talentoso, las historias inspiradoras de los inspiradores, los creadores de esas historias que acabamos de asistir, que es una inspiración para todos nosotros, y a ustedes por su presencia, por su compromiso con la educación en Colombia, que no es solo un compromiso con la educación en Colombia, sino lo que se logra aquí, se observa en el exterior, se disemina por el exterior, y lo que aquí sucede de bueno se nota. Entonces está haciendo un trabajo muy importante para la humanidad. Bueno, dichas esas palabras de introducción, les pongo de alerta que preparé mis comentarios en un otro idioma, en inglés, que voy a pasar a usar, a hablarles en inglés, que si quieren tiempo para colocarles los audífonos. Empiezo solo diciendo que represento a la Universidad de Columbia, que está en una de las mayores ciudades del mundo, más ruidosas incluso, que al que tú indicas tiene muy poco que ver con la realidad rural de Colombia o la realidad rural de cualquier otro país, pero yo creo que hay puntos de conexión que les presento en mis comentarios. Y luego también hago nota de la gran semejanza en inglés, por lo menos, de nuestros nombres. Colombia y el Colombia se asemejan en español. En inglés pasan por la misma pronuncia, así que la gente cuando se refieren a su país están inconscientemente haciendo una campaña publicitaria para nuestra universidad, Colombia, que usan la misma pronuncia. Bueno, sin más de introducción, empiezo ahora a dedicarme a un tema desafiante y paso para hablar en inglés, que está preparado en inglés. As a person who represents a major global university, one with a very strong commitment to Latin America, I welcome the opportunity to address this audience on the topic of education and peace. Common words, de uso diario, but what two words together could be more important? Education creates the conditions for peace to prevail. Peace allows education to flourish and to become diffused among all the populations of the world. To paraphrase somewhat, the words of a great religious leader could be said that education is the new name for peace. This seems especially true in the context of Colombia today, but also in the rest of Latin America and in the United States as well. Colombia no está solo. Complacency for those who have reached higher levels of education. Complacency is the enemy. In the pursuit of a broadly educated population, it is extremely dangerous to lose sight of the importance of education. It is partly why what is happening in Colombia today, as I said in my opening remarks, building peace through education is so important in the world today. This afternoon's session, of which I'm a part, looks at this theme with a special concern for the poorest of the poor in the rural areas and territorios of Colombia, those most affected by the horrors of war. So one may ask, as I do in these remarks, what does Columbia University in the city of New York, that's its full name, or indeed any of the great universities of the world, which can seem so very far away from us here in El Cubo and in the beauty of Bogota, those universities must seem very far away. What do they have to do with the challenges that face you in Colombia today in education? But it isn't so hard to understand that, for if it is true that the ideals of education and peace are fundamental to humanity, surely these are shared ideals, shared between you and the world's great universities, and their desire, their motivation, their driving impulse to take knowledge, and to make practical applications of it in specific settings, including in the human drama unfolding right here in your country. So what sort of dialogue should exist between this country and this global university, Colombia? What unites them besides the similarity in their names? Let's consider some of the connections, and perhaps you can help me make some of your own once I conclude with my remarks. Let me just begin with something we've heard over and over in the last 2 days here in La Cumbre, a consideration of the challenge of education in Latin America today. It is certainly the case that Latin America has made enormous strides in education, inspiring strides in education of its citizens, and it continues to do so as we speak this moment. But the same progress in education is occurring in many peaceful and democratic societies all over the world who have used their educational advantages to improve the lives of all, or at least of most of their citizens, beyond what has been possible for us to accomplish in America Latina. The reality is, unfortunately, but it's also an inspiration, the reality is that Latin America continues to lag very badly behind the rest of the world in educational accomplishment. In particular, Latin America is very far from the global frontiers of knowledge and innovation that economists teach us, and I believe to be true, knowledge and innovation that drive economic growth in the world today and will drive it even more in the future. The rest of the world is not standing still while Latin America strives to catch up. Let me look at different levels of education. If one looks at the rankings of the world's great universities, the top 200, for example, in the Times of London rankings, only the smallest handful are based in this region of the world. And those that are, one thinks of USP in Sao Paulo and the UNAM in Mexico. Only these are ranked toward the bottom of the ratings. While there are many Chinese and Indian universities in those same rankings. If we look at the educational accomplishments at the high school level, and this we have seen with previous conferencistas, we look at the results for the OECD PISA findings. Even if you didn't know what that was before yesterday, you've heard it many times. They're released every 2 years, and they look at the knowledge of 15-year-old children, adolescents, in relatively good schools in their countries. Look, what do the ratings tell us? That in terms of science education, Latin America is in the bottom 1/3 of the global rankings. And Colombia and Brazil are in the middle of the Latin American group, so not even at the top of Latin America. In mathematics education, what else is more important in a technologically driven world than mathematics? In mathematics education, Latin America's global performance is even weaker than in the sciences. This includes measurements for Colombia and for Brazil. Reading scores in all of Latin America are improving, but the story is unfortunately the same. A significant lag in reading with respect to the rest of the world. These PISA results for 15-year-olds reflect deficiencies even for relatively well-off children in Bogota, in Medellin, in Cali, and Rio, Sao Paulo. In the region schools, the deficit begins in the earliest years of education, and it is a significant deficit. 15-year-olds on average in Latin America in these subjects, these critical subjects, are 1 to 2 to 3 grade levels behind counterparts in other parts of the world. Those counterparts in the rest of the world are our friends. We're all global citizens. We're all committed to peace. But they're also competing with us economically and also advancing the prosperity of their citizens more quickly than we are. That gap has got to be made up. Some of the reasons for these deficiencies appear to have a ready explanation. The region spends only a fraction on education by comparison to the richer countries, some 30% per student is spent in Colombia and Brazil, to use the two countries I use as references. 30% of what is spent in the OECD. The United States is far from the best performer among developed countries, but Colombia only spends 1/5 per student, and Brazil only 1/4 of what is spent in the United States, where we have tremendous work to do too. We have to increase what we spend in education in the United States. But perhaps more than money is involved, because if we put it only in financial or fiscal terms, too easily that leads to despair. We are not wealthy countries. We struggle. We have many priorities. But that doesn't excuse what is happening in education. So I think something more than money is involved. These better performing societies are better mobilized to improve and diffuse educational best practices than Latin America is. So I'll run quickly through some slides just to give you a little bit of a break from my spoken words, or a little something visual to emphasize some of the points. This looks only at the PISA scores in science. Again, those are numbers, hard to read, but they're not good. Chile, by far the best performer in Latin America. These are the results in mathematics. If you look at that blackboard, I can understand why the kids may be having trouble in math. I think most of us would be, but you get the idea. These are the results in reading. Again, el caso de Chile is interesting. It shows there's nothing inherent in Latin American culture that prevents the region from catching up. Chile is catching up. It's still far behind, but it's catching up, and it shows that it can't, yes, sí se puede in Latin America. These are the expenditures. If you ignore the highest expenditure on the left, but look at all the others, those are expenditures per student in the developed world, the OECD, Brazil and Colombia. If you've got good eyes, you can see they come in toward the tail end. Certainly much more needs to be done. So I'd like to take you now a brief description. I'm an economist, so I sometimes can't resist talking a little bit about economic theory. But I did want to tell you that the consequences of poor educational results are very bad for the economy, and they're devastating for current generations and for future generations. The mistakes we make today, the children who are not educated today, are going to cost the economy, cost standards of living 20 years from now. The data show us that the most educated countries, those with the most access to the global marketplace of ideas, are also the most innovative. They go faster over longer periods of time. Their growth is sustained. None of these, what in Brazil are called voo de galinha, vuelos cortos de crecimiento. No, the best educated, the most innovative grow for long periods of time. But in innovation as well, Latin American economies lag badly behind. It is innovation. Think about it, the ability to create new products, new ways of organizing firms and schools and governments. That's innovation too. To quickly adapt to the new technologies coming from abroad, that's innovation. That's what drives growth. But our scores, Brazil and Colombia both, are among the lowest in most world surveys. We have to see innovation as part, and I'll switch to another chart here, as the result of a very virtuous circle. What are the component parts of the circle, the links in the circle? Education broadly spread among a population assures that advances in technology are readily absorbed not only in Bogotá or in the best neighborhoods of São Paulo, but throughout all the territories of the nation. It's education. Public investment, priority for spending on research and development, often in close collaboration with universities, building universities, helping professors in universities, laboratories, science. That public investment enhances productivity in the economy as well as generates new knowledge. The key link in the circle is synchronization, a sort of a funny word, but synchronization, everything working together. That's what synchronization is. The educational system produces well-prepared citizens. a government relentlessly pursues advanced technological policies appropriate for the country, of course. But technology and technology policy is relentlessly pursued by the government. And innovative, dynamic, private firms create jobs for those young people in technology-based industries. That's the virtuous circle. That's where we want to arrive. A world in which innovation drives economic growth and takes Colombia and Brazil out of the sort of global middle class where we are today and into the upper levels of income where we want to be, where we deserve to be, where we should be. Another critical key is openness. We talk a lot sobre el TLC in Colombia, and we act as though global trade was trade in commodities, coffee, iron ore, petroleum or manufactured goods, steel, automobiles, computers. But free trade is about something much more important. It's about being open to the free flow of ideas and knowledge being produced all over the world, encouraging that knowledge by sending Colombians outside, by welcoming researchers from abroad, and with a whole new emphasis. That's what openness means. What is going on in the world today? You've heard it from a more expert speaker than I this morning. Those of you who are here in the morning sessions, it's something that goes by the code name, that's what they call it in the newspapers, La Revolución Industrial 4.0, Industrial Revolution. What's that all about? Well, for me and for many of us in the room, it's a lot of words we read in the newspaper. We don't really understand them, but they are driving the world. Big data, to solve problems, to analyze data we never had the capacity to do before. Artificial intelligence, machine learning, robots, robotica, autos sin conductores, driverless cars, monedas virtuales, virtual currencies that can revolutionize finance and democratize finance, and at least that's their promise. So as we speak, the outlines, as we speak today, the outlines of this whole new global economy are emerging right before our eyes. We cannot be indifferent to that, even if it isn't taking place right here in our department or right here in our region of the world. Latin America must also be part of that world, the world of innovation and knowledge, if it is to escape the middle-income trap in which it finds itself today. This requires a holistic view of education, one that reaches from the most excluded groups in the most remote territories of your country or the inner regions of Brazil, that reaches from those children and a concern with their education all the way through to promoting the great universities of Latin America and research centers to make them what they should be, which is to say, world-class. Because there are enough people being generated in our educational systems right now to create such world-class institutions. We have no lack of talent. We have a lack of priority, some lack of funding, some lack of organization, but it can be done. I can move quickly. This is a rather difficult slide, rather difficult to understand. Inside the black square is sort of the process of innovation as it occurs within an individual country, say Colombia. But just to call attention to the black borders, that's sort of the borders with the global knowledge economy. May they always be open. May there be as much concern for free exchange and as much value given to free exchange of ideas as there is to free exchange of goods. That's the point I'm trying to make. So let me go from there to a little bit in the context of Colombia today, and I am inspired by what I've heard this afternoon and what I know to be true about so many good people in Colombia working in so many remote areas for so little money, for so little recognition. That's why the recognition you gave them is so valuable. But all of this talk about driverless cars and virtual currencies, it could seem very remote to you, to all of us, from the concerns of these young children in areas of conflict. The tragedy in Syria, you'll see a photo of it there, comes most immediately to mind, one that Columbia University is not indifferent to. This is also the context, luckily not quite as severe as in Syria, but this context of conflict and violence exists in Colombia today and in much of Latin America, in our rural areas, but also in our great cities. And as we are taught, and as we know, the disruption of education due to armed conflict is disastrous for economic growth, now and in the future. And it's disastrous as well for innovative capacity in the long run. Children do not lose the right to education simply because they live in the midst of conflict. We know that to be true, and we must act as though it's true. If these children, the poorest of the poor in the most remote of areas of rural Colombia, are excluded, and other children who live in marginalized and violence-prone communities excluded as well, all of our efforts to build great universities, to promote research, to improve our PISA scores, all of that will be a building built upon sand. It will not stand. It will not achieve the results we need. So let me say that the situation of conflict affects much of the rest of Latin America. Unfortunately, Colombia is no exception and may actually be in a better position than other Latin American countries where conflict is affecting the education of children today all over the region. We all know communities and schools torn apart by drug violence in Mexico and El Salvador. And many examples from the beautiful city in which I live, Rio de Janeiro, where Columbia University has a regional office, where violence now related increasingly to drug gangs is rampant, and the children, the education of children suffers greatly. Much concern is directed at this problem in Brazil and in Rio. For example, the city of Rio, and I'll show you a slide in a moment, has sought to respond to the plight of these children who, in the most violence-prone areas of Rio, who are the future of their city. The city has tried to respond in a very creative way, working with UNESCO, as Escolas do Amanhã, the schools for tomorrow, launched 4 or 5 years ago, aims in a quite simple, but quite dramatic way, to improve the infrastructure and quality of teaching in 140 primary schools in Rio, located in violence-prone areas of the city. We used to call them favelas. They're communities, and they deserve the dignity of that name. But the 140 most violent, they get better schools, the children nicer uniforms, the teachers better pay, the school itself better security, more involvement of the parents, rewards for teachers and for principals whose schools improved the most quickly in citywide competitions. The initial results of the Escolas do Amanhã are very encouraging and could serve as a model for much of Latin America if the government in Rio follows through. And that, of course, is a question that bothers us all, if the government follows through. Children in these schools in Rio really did seem to learn better and faster than counterparts in the wealthier areas of Rio, and morale among teachers has improved. Yet the problems persist in Rio, certainly, and must never be underestimated. Summing up, before I show you a few pictures, children everywhere have an intrinsic right to education, even in times of conflict. It is a basic human right. Failure to guarantee this basic right is not only a human tragedy, but it is a disaster for economic growth. Let me just show a few slides. Some of these involve work of Columbia University around the world, others do not, but I thought I'd show them together to show that we are certainly not alone. This is a series of recent newspaper headlines. I think that you'll understand the Portuguese that's being used and see the problems I'm talking about. 22,000 kids without schools in Rio, 9,000 in another favela of the Maré. Drug trafficking leaves children without school in the mountainous area near the city. Interruptions in classes in Rio, totaling 30 days this academic year. Violence in Rio leaving 7,000 more students. There's about 700,000 students in the network without schools this coming Monday. But there is hope. That's the bad news, and it's the news, and it's every day. But we mustn't close our eyes that there are good people, just like many of you, just like those people who spoke to us a few minutes ago, trying to do something about it. This is an example of the Favela da Maré, the community of Maré, and we're located right near the Rio airport, for those of you who have visited our beautiful city. And on the left is a short time collection of data. It's only 5 or 6 years long, but it shows in the red line that the children in these schools did begin to catch up, at least in the area of reading, and they did so very quickly. My time is approaching an end, but I wanted to go back to the challenge I set at the beginning. I'm sorry, these are just a few other examples drawn from conflict situations around the world. The scene in Gaza on the top right is particularly striking. The armed, almost prison gates outside a primary school in another Rio favela, the famous one known as City of God, yet another. These are examples from the great work of the School of Education of Columbia University in refugee camps in Ecuador, in Lebanon, and in Kenya, and programs not only to deal with refugee children, the most disadvantaged of the disadvantaged, but also teachers for teachers. I'm going to go quickly to another world, another reality, and I'm sure you'll share my initial question: what in the world does Columbia University, this beautiful, peaceful place, so far away, wonderful students, wonderful teachers, great science, beautiful buildings, what does it have to do with the reality we're describing today? Well, I think the main characteristics of Columbia University, I trust, are reasonably well known to you, as are those of the other 10 to 15 great universities in the world, of which Columbia is one. It has a history of 270 years. Its undergraduate, college, and graduate programs are ranked among the best in the United States. 90 premios Nobel. A very distinguished recent graduate is President Barack Obama. So they're doing something right. And in the words of President Lee Bollinger of Columbia University, it could be seen and could be said, and it's widely understood to be true, that higher education in the United States is among the most successful institutions ever created. And they're playing a great work right now when we need them the most in the United States. But this is not a reason for pride or complacency or autosatisfacción. U.S. universities haven't been successful by staying in that beautiful campus area. They've been successful by engaging with the United States as a whole initially, and then with the world at large, fostering intellectual discovery and practical knowledge across a variety of academic areas, in the firm conviction that you cannot understand the world from the Upper West Side of Manhattan. You have to be in the world to help solve the world's problems. Globally, I'll just mention 3 initiatives of the university as my time is up. We have more international students at Columbia University than any Ivy League university, an enormous dependence. This is why the proposed travel ban on immigrants, on refugees, is so damaging to Columbia University, potentially. I found out yesterday that due to a long partnership that Columbia University has with Colfuturo and Colciencias, we've received the second largest group of Colombian students in the last 20 years. Only one other university in the world has received more Colombian students from Colombia than Columbia has, and we want to continue to be receiving your best and sending your best back to work with you. So that's one initiative. The second is the creation of what are called global centers around the world. I run one of these centers in Rio. We have another for the Grupo Andino based in Santiago. These centers exist not to create new universities. You have great universities here in Colombia and in Brazil, but they exist to connect the best that Colombia has to offer to people in Latin America looking for solutions to their problems in Latin America. These centers have proven useful in Chile and in Brazil, And they could prove equally so, I believe, if given an opportunity, if the conditions are right, in Colombia, in other major countries of the region. They are all about promoting the free flow of ideas, so critical to innovation and to growth in the long run. I'm going to finish then without talking about yet other global initiatives, and in the interest of time, let me just conclude with my main points today. That education needs to be, I'm not saying anything new, but it needs repeating. Education needs to be a priority for all countries, especially in Latin America, and especially in times of violence. At the same time, we need a holistic view of education in Latin America, one that looks critically at our educational performance from the first years of pre-jardín to postgraduate education. Global universities, even if they seem very far from you, or the many regions of your great country, have a role to play and want to play a role. Columbia University is among the forefront of U.S. universities seeking to play this role, and it has, and that's why I'm there, a special commitment to Latin America. And I would end by saying a special admiration for the people of Colombia, for the example of Colombia in ending conflict, in not forgetting the poorest of the poor in the rural areas, and for truly teaching us that education is the new name for peace. Muchas gracias a todos.
Okay, thank you so much. Muy bien, pues muchísimas gracias al doctor Tribat por su interesante exposición. Y sin duda alguna, el tema de la paz tiene muchísimas aristas. Ya hemos escuchado sobre la importancia de la educación, esto como herramienta para consolidar escenarios alejados de la violencia y sí, llenos de paz. Pero ¿qué tipo de capacidades se requieren para construir entonces una sociedad en paz? Pues para hablarnos de esta importante cuestión, demos paso a Rodrigo Rivera, Alto Comisionado para la Paz. Quiero que lo recibamos con un muy fuerte aplauso.